A warm morning, one and all. I'm Lakshmi Nandana and I'm part of the ERUDITES team. Today, I'm here to welcome all of you to the very first panel discussion of the second International Legal and Policy Conference on the Future of Transport, Fall or Rise of the Transport Sector. We have our very first panelist here on the topic Outer Space Activism. May the force be with us. Mr. Anil Prakash from Satcom Industries Association, Ashok GV from Factum Law, Dr. Rajeshwari Pillai Rajagopalan from Observer Research Foundation, and Chinmay Roy of Endrix Corporation Limited, Department of Space, Government of India. And I'm very pleased to welcome today's moderator, Dr. Purvi Kantru ma'am of Aerospace and Aviation, Lawyers Association of India. Last but not the least, my warmest welcome to all the attendees who are from various fields and from different parts of the world to today's incredible session. Now, I invite Dr. Purvi Kantru ma'am to commence the session. Thank you. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you, Lakshmi. Thank you so much. Very good morning, everyone. Space has been identified as one of the potential driver and contributor in achieving sustainable development goals globally. And space activities are critical to socio-economic growth, technological innovation, advancement, scientific discovery, security, industrial competitiveness, job creation, and most importantly, human resource development. The agenda for today's conference that we bring forth here at this platform is that we would like to discuss and we would like to deliberate how do we bring open the sector, the private sector and the players who are playing a key role. And specifically with regards to India, we are trying to discuss, because a lot is brewing up legally and a policy point of view, the Space Bill 2017, the draft for humans in space policy in India for 2021, amendments to the SATCOM, to name a few that demonstrate that India has opened its panels and its doors to the commercial space and paving way for the private sector in a much competitive way. Having said that, there are a couple of nitty-gritties in the legislation that need further tweak, and they need to pass the eyes of the experts to strengthen its core. Please join me today with a hand-picked of stellar panel that I have with me today, experts that would deliberate on legal and policy aspects of security, privatization, and the way forward. This marks the beginning of what we call as space activism, where we deliberate on key issues. I welcome Mr. Anil Prakash from Satcom Industry Association for his presentation today.
Okay, sorry for slight glitch. Let me start my presentation. This is Satcom Industry Association. This is a body which basically is a non-profit, and we represent satellite industry ecosystem, whether it's a manufacturer or startups or legal fraternity. So my presentation part today is very short and crisp because I think my time was given about 7 to 8 minutes. So my presentation would be focused to India's space sector at a glance, policy and regulatory status of global positioning, satellite manufacturing ecosystem, new opportunity for innovation and business case, capacity building to the future. And I would like to bring it to this is a very interesting slide in front of you that shows once left-hand side you see that there is a total global market which is about 360 billion, and India has got about close to about 3% share of it, and we have a budget allocated which is 1.5 billion, and we have a satellite broadband market which is close to about 100 billion today, and you see the growth chart, which is we hope to rise from 3% to 10%, and then followed by 100 billion, and which is as the global market will grow. But provided that the importance to the policy framework and the regulatory framework should be conducive enough to put this this growth trajectory to help that. And this number of very strong powered by satellite. You see the 900 plus TV channels are powered by them, and 70 million DTH subscriber, 125,000 VSAT ATMs, and around 50,000 satellite automotive gas station, and about 6,500 trains are being powered and by the satellite, and about 40,000 kiosks, which provide government to citizen service, and about this is going to be about 2 trillion market networking. So this is which I think the growth has started from 2018, startup by National Digital Communication Policy, and you see every policy which is coming in the way, it is giving a booster to the growth of the industry, and we are very happy and very pleased that the last couple of years policy are taking place very well. You starting from 2018, then December 14, the announcement of in-flight and maritime connectivity rules. Then September 2021, this is a UL amendment provided cellular backhaul connected through VSAT CAG service. Then October 15, 2020, it is space-based communication policy of India draft came in. And then November 2020, then the draft-based remote sensing policy came in. And February 2021, draft human space policy India is adopted. And you see that a couple of these things have really put this thing in the rocket launch. And so this is a growth pattern. I think this is very well set down, and provided that it has to be go in the right perspective, and the policy framework should get implementation mode. Now we see that there are certain gaps which we have to look into it, and these gaps are there is a as a previous opening and inaugural session, we mentioned that there is a space law had to be required, and there is a clear space law in the country is required, and which is also will guide. There should be like a guiding torch to all the policies and framework which is coming the way. Of course, then we also need a regulatory framework where the new startups or anybody who wanted to develop system, the testing ground need to be protected. And then space startup needs separate provisions, so it should not be all in the queue of the large startups, and it has to be dealt separately. And so then also it requires that access to space spectrum frequency for development of this industry, and there has to be clear and single window mechanism between that. There's a lot of time taking place by the clearances, provisions, and all things. So I think that's also be required that short-term experience license should be granted for the development of this sector. And then last is the funding support. I think it's need a constant steady flow for funds for this industry, and there is also need for non-dilutive funding, startup building, prototype, and demonstrate proof of concept. And this is required, and also provision of the CSR, corporate social responsibility, for the startup funding, which has been provisioned by the government earlier. So now this is this is a startup and global position. If you see, then the picture is not. It's a good in terms of like we have about 500 firms engaged in direct and indirect space technology. And you left-hand side graph shows that, of course, the funding has come into way, but steadily from 2019 to 2021. And there are about 50 space active state now, which is about nearly 60% of launch after 2014. And this figure is at par with the Japan and Korea. Of course, China has taken a lead into that. So if you look at the space startup, India have plans involving human space flight, and it's likely the union government to include private space tech startup in the draft human space in the space policy. In APEC region, the India, Japan, and China are three big, and it is basically emergence of international competitive across easily dividing with their Western counterpart with aggressive expansion strategy. And Japan's space debris removal company Astro Scale has raised almost over 200 millions, which is in India. Total funding raised by a space startup is nearly about 31 billion in 2020. So if you do that, from 5 to 10 years away, We are not far behind the European or American developed space sector, but we are catching up with them very fast. So this is shows that left-hand side picture shows that what it's called consists of the manufacturing, and the large space chunk is taken of the space application, and then rocket launch, which is close to 0.14, and satellite manufacturing about 0.35, and ground equipment is 1.8. And this is a breakup, and India has to catch up with the global. Now we need to have push to the satellite manufacturing, ground equipment manufacturing, and the support system. And I think this is the recent government initiative in delinking ground segment satellite gateways from the licensing. I think this is a matter of a great pride, and the regulator is already gone into the consultation with that, and soon they will be submitting their recommendation to the government. And if you look at this upstream sector is about 33% of space market. Satellite manufacturing launch market is nearly $500 million industry, whereas global market is about 23 billion. More than 50% of components are imported for satellites and launch vehicles. Local manufacturers don't find it feasible to manufacture these space components. I think it is required a complete ecosystem to develop in India, so at least the homogeneous growth is taken in the manufacturing field. So this is also they are going to touch upon these two great ingredients which can boost indigenous manufacturing. That is that inclusive space manufacturing under defense offset policy, and production link incentive to be applicable for space manufacturing. So these two factors will have a catalytic role in the manufacturing industry in India. And of course, it will definitely attract foreign direct investment in the country and generate millions of jobs, contribute substantially to the GDP, and improve the space sector market share significantly. This is a new opportunity for innovation and business case. I just touched upon that the space delivery is a big challenge, and I think it should be taken into a kind of opportunity for the businesses. There are close to about 170 million pieces of space debris are floating in Earth orbit, and it's and because at the same time there is a surge of satellite launches that have taken place from the 2014, and we're going to be thousands of constellations coming on the sky. The market of space junk removal is huge. The global space debris monitoring and removal market size was USD 803 million in 2020. It likely to reach about 1.3 billion in 2028, and India should also grab the slice of this pie. It's great opportunity for innovation, business case. There are two techniques that are trending. Debris removal technology, which has got multiple methods and technology to remove space debris. Several startups have come up with the debris capturing solution, which are on trial and will be commercializing soon. On-orbit service technology is a disrupting the market in which it can extend the existing life of the satellite. It presents new opportunity for refueling, inspection, repair, maintenance of satellite, and significant area of need for future space growth, enable the maturation of technology and the economic prospects. This is my last slide, and where I touched upon the capacity building program. Firstly, global cooperation, not competition, is the future of the space industry. There must be well planned and how a partnership between economies could meet the country's pledge to increase its share of the global space industry. Investors are looking at the ground opportunity that some of these markets possess, hence events to collaborate investors and startups. Collaboration amongst all stakeholders, government, industry, academia, association, research institutions, and space laws and astropreneur. Absence of university courses that involve rocket and satellite technology, again, there is an opportunity for academia to collaborate and help in the chemistry building. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Anil. I now call upon Dr. Rajeshwari Pillai with her presentation.
Hi, good morning, everyone, and it's great to be part of the panel, and thank you, Dr. Purvi. for moderating this panel. So I guess looking at the panelists, I guess all of us have our own kind of niche specialties. So I don't think we will be, hopefully won't do much of a repetition in a sense. So let me try and outline a few contextualizing developments, a few scene-setting developments in the area of space security, which I believe would continue to continue to dominate the policy debates within the country, but also at the regional level or at the global scale. So space has changed in many significant ways over the past decade and a half. One is, of course, the growth in the number of actors. And the second is, of course, the diversification of players involved in space, which are some, in a sense, some of the big drivers in the changes that we see today. The space domain that used to be dominated by a handful of states today have, and with state-run programs, today we have about more than 80 players active in the domain, and these include a growing number from the space industry side, as Mr. Anil pointed out a few minutes ago. Meanwhile, you also have the space pursued by billionaires reaching a pinnacle. Within a span of 2 weeks in July, you saw two billionaires, Richard Branson from Virgin Galactic and Jeff Bezos of Blue Origin, making historical suborbital flights, pushing open the envelope of space tourism. But this also opens new questions like who an astronaut is. Can the passengers of these commercial flights, these tourists, can they be called astronauts? There are also developments pertaining to the moon and interplanetary missions that are gaining centrality. China's first solo interplanetary mission, Tianwen-1, consisting of an orbiter, lander, and rover, successfully entered the Martian orbit in February 2021. You had the United Arab Emirates with their Hope Mars mission in 2020, reaching again orbit in 21. NASA's Perseverance, again, another mission to collect the first ever sample of Martian rock. Again, there have been a lot of these developments, but from an Indian perspective, for the Indo-Pacific or the Asia-Pacific perspective, I think China's growing sophisticated space capabilities in some of the certain niche areas have driven much of the competition that we see when you look at space from a security or strategic perspective. In fact, these have driven the other two major Asian powers, space players, both India and Japan, to respond in their own ways. India's attempt to, for instance, soft land on the lunar surface faced a setback, but nevertheless, I believe it is a reflection of the budding Asian space competition. A successful mission, for instance, would have put India as a second Asian power to successfully carry out an unmanned lunar mission. 6 years ago, then you had India became the first Asian country to send an orbiter around the Mars, the Mangalyaan mission. And as there are many more upcoming missions which will keep India upcoming Venus mission is something that we are going to look at. Second mission to the Mars. There are many more plans in this regard. It's sort of indicating some of the competitive dynamics that play out in the Indo-Pacific region. Japan too has had some impressive achievements such as Lunar Orbiter mission in 2007. Although this has been followed more by commercially viable projects. This has been followed by commercially viable projects like the Hayabusa mission, which is the first time a spacecraft landed on an asteroid and brought back samples. So Asia is, in a sense, witnessing a fair share of competition playing out. And this trend, I believe, will only intensify as we look ahead. Interestingly, many of these missions are driven by the terrestrial power politics than any other factor. Therefore, Asia will continue to have important scientific and technological advancements. But I think the tense geopolitics of Asia will also intensify the space security dynamics in the coming years. So this emerging competition in Asia is no more about attempting their own first and so on and so forth. Who's going to be the first to reach moon or a sort of an area that has not been explored before and so on and so forth. But it is moving to the security domain as well. And I think that has more security implications. For instance, India tested an ASAT weapon, anti-satellite weapon in March 2019. But this was only an effort to catch up with the capability that China had already demonstrated first time in January 2007 successfully. After the Chinese ASAT test, India began to feel the need for developing its own deterrent capability to ensure that its assets are protected. And other spacefaring powers are re-examining their options, strategies, and capabilities, assigning a greater security role to their space programs. For instance, after the Chinese ASAT test, the US undertook its own ASAT test in 2008. India thereafter now has gone on to conduct a tabletop war game called the InSpaceX in 2019, with all the stakeholders, including the scientific establishment, military, and so on and so forth. Along with the capability development, India is also shaping up institutional architecture to develop the longer-term strategies for space utilization and its integration into the armed forces. So in a sense, the evolving space security developments are even more significant, I would say, as compared to some of the civil developments on the civilian side, because there are a number of other developments, such as the development of a range of counter space capabilities, including kinetic ASAT weapons, cyber and electronic warfare technology, directed energy weapons, by a handful of states, which are in a sense resulting in destabilizing dynamics, pushing other countries to pursue these mechanisms as well. In fact, the developments in our neighborhood has pushed India to develop some of these capabilities in-house. In fact, the DRDO has come out with a lot of different statements from time to time saying that we are also developing some of these capabilities. So each of these developments have, in a sense, at the same time, pushed space to become more crowded, competitive, and even conflict-ridden. And if the current trends continue, continued safe, secure, and sustainable use of space, access to space cannot be guaranteed. So I think that's something that we are in a sense. So having said that, what are we kind of dealing with? Very quickly, one is crowded space, which I've already talked about, and the space security dynamics are again becoming more complex, partly due to the crowded and congested nature of space. But a direct issue from that arises from a crowded outer space in the realm is space traffic management and orbital debris that have implications for safe, secure, and sustainable use of outer space. A second important aspect in this regard is also that space is a dual asset, and many countries are beginning to use space for a variety of military and security applications. Radio frequency interference, for instance, could be a result of the increasingly crowded nature of outer space, but there are also deliberate attempts to jam or impede radio signals and so on and so forth. Laser dazzling, blinding, or using cyber means to create temporary disruptions as well as denial of services to generate interference in command and control systems, logistic networks. All of these are happening, and these are in a sense worrying. A second major impact is the military space programs as a response to some of these developments by a few handful of countries. Which again, for the interest of time, I'm going to skip over it. A third important aspect is dedicated military space institutions. Of course, Trump, when he established the US Space Force, it received astonishing amount of publicity by way of newspaper headlines. But the fact is that the US effort was just the last or the latest in a series of such actions by other major space players as well. So in 2011, Russia brought out certain institutional modernization, creating the Russian Aerospace Defense Forces, again, meant for space security related activities. Similarly, in 2015, China established the PLA Strategic Support Force, which saw the integration of the PLA space, cyber, and electronic warfare capabilities, making it a much more potent force and considerably sort of consequential for a number of countries, especially in the neighborhood and beyond. And of course, India has set up its own defense space agency, and the establishment of all of these different kinds of specialized space units have important implications for India, but also for the larger region and beyond. And as space becomes more integrated and assumes more direct roles for conventional military operations, it can be expected that states would continue to seek improved coordination of the military and security functions, which call for developing these institutions. The French and the Germans also have gone about creating their own version of the Space Command. In May 2020, Japan went about in this direction by creating the Space Operations Squadron. So in a sense, there is a big military focus that are beginning to happen over the last decade or so. And I would think while the competition is partly a result of the terrestrial politics, but I think another important issue is, in a sense, the global balance of power and the regional balance of power, shift in the balance of power dynamics. While the US continues to be the most dominant power, the ability of countries like China and others to catch up, I think they're also kind of shaping the kind of dynamics that we see, including in space. So the terrestrial politics is being extended to space. And these are also complicating the significantly the global governance debates, the ability for all the states and other players to come together and establish or review some of the rules of the road. So global governance has become particularly problematic due to the large number of factors, diversity of factors, of course, the changing geopolitics. And I think another important question that has been part of this debate is how do you incorporate the private sector and give them a bigger voice in the space governance area. But I think we are stuck in a couple of different places. For instance, the multilateral negotiations, these have not gone very far for more than 2 decades now. The space security debates and arms control debates happen at this Conference on Disarmament in Geneva, which is a UN body. And the CD, this Conference on Disarmament, has been stuck in a stalemate for more than 2 decades, 2.5 decades now, close to it. So we are talking about very serious difficulties, and I think the changing geopolitics make it that much harder to make any significant progress. I'm sure I'll take on some of the questions later during the Q&A. My time is up, I think. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Pillai. Thank you for your time. I would now call upon Mr. Chinmay Roy from Anthrics with his presentation.
Good morning, everyone. 1 minute, I'm just starting my slide. Yeah, very good morning to the distinguished panelists, the moderator, and all the attendees. Today, I'll be presenting on the regulatory challenges that we may face due to the satellite mega constellations that are on the anvil. So to start with, the satellite mega constellations are basically a number of satellites operated by one single operator, and they tend to provide internet connectivity to far-flung areas and also to normal users. And this is a great technological advancement, and we can see that we have come so far from the geostationary satellites to low Earth orbit satellites, and they promise to provide very low latency internet that is close to the fibers that we use, the fiber internet, and they tend to solve the distance gap for far-flung areas. That makes me recall that not many years back, even Andaman Nicobar and our forces in the mountains, they were completely dependent on the geostationary satellites of the INSAT system. And now Andaman Nicobar has a fiber network that has laid down, and that has solved the internet connectivity problem. But still, the ships and other naval vessels in the oceans face the connectivity problem, and they are not able to get internet connectivity. These mega constellations promise to solve that problem. So how do they carry that over? They put a large number of satellites in the low Earth orbit, and that is somewhere close to 300 to 1500 kilometers altitude from the Earth's surface. And from these satellites, they can directly uplink and downlink with small antennas placed on the Earth's surface. And Starlink has even started its services in Europe and in the Americas, and they are in the process of taking regulatory approvals in India as well. They offer a very cheap plan compared to what has been on offer before from satellite internet. Around $99 per month is what is their plan that they currently show. And along with the technological advancements, there are certain challenges and problems for the outer space activities that is also posed by these mega constellations. So let us have a look at some of the statistics. So till now, in the last 60 years of the space history of from launches from the Earth, there are around 8,100 payloads that have been launched, and today there are somewhere around 1950 satellites which are still active. But if we add the total number of these mega constellations, what they project to put up in the low Earth orbit, that itself will be somewhere close to 70,000 to 75,000 satellites. So what we would be witnessing is almost a 6-time increase in the number of satellites from that compared to the total satellites launched in the last 60 years. So 1 decade, we can witness an increase in satellite numbers by 6 times. So practically there will be 1 satellite that will be on the Earth's surface for a squares of 100-kilometer sites. So that has posed a number of challenges. So the first challenge that was witnessed was by ITU, that how to grant licenses for operating such satellites, because previously ITU was dealing with fixed orbit satellites or geostationary satellites, and there the orbit was fixed and there was 1 satellite on 1 orbit. But what we will now be seeing is a number of satellites in the low Earth orbit, and there's no fixed orbital slot. So what ITU decided is that they will grant 1 license for a complete satellite system, and they'll grant 7 years time. They'll say that you have to deploy 10% of your projected satellites within first 2 years, and then 50 years within the next 5 years. So finally, within the complete span of 7 years, they have to put in the 100% of the projected satellites. So that was one of the challenges, but there are other challenges as well. Now, the main challenge that we would be seeing is in form of debris creation and debris management. So there is a great risk of debris creation, and that can be categorized in 2 folds. Like when a low Earth orbit satellite is generally launched by these satellite constellations, they put it at a very low Earth orbit, and then they gradually raise the orbit to their designated orbit. So in the travel from the lower top, from the orbit of their launch to the orbit where they would be sitting for the rest of their lives, that transfer process is very risky because if we see, there are a large number of space debris that are in that orbit, and in most cases they are so small in size that they do not have a proper thrust mechanism. They have very micro thrusters, and they cannot make that sort of maneuvering activities what it would be required. And when they are in the orbit, then as well there's a great threat that is posed. The threat there is basically from the already present particles, satellite particles, and also other satellites. So that is a big threat. Apart from that, there is also a threat on astronomical activities. The dark skies play a very important role in astronomical activities, and astronomers around the world are posing the grievances that they are not able to get the right amount of darkness in order to carry out observations of the outer space objects, and the low Earth orbits, they often intersect in their observations and cause a lot of problems. There is also a signal interference that is caused due to the presence of the low Earth orbits, and that is mostly solved by ITU by giving them a secondary sort of recognition. The primary recognition and the primary signal ownership is given to the geostationary satellites so that there is no interference, and the low Earth orbit satellites have agreed to live with that, agreed to let the geostationary signals be transmitted, and then their signals be taken after such signal has been transmitted. So if we see, currently there are somewhere around 19,000 cataloged objects in the space which are larger than 10 centimeters. Most of them are non-active satellites. A few of them are only active in the low Earth orbit, and there are somewhere close to 5 lakh smaller uncatalogued fragments that are 1 centimeter or less than 1 centimeter. So these many objects are moving on in the orbit from 300 to 1500 kilometer altitude. And that's where all these 72,000 planned satellites are also scheduled to come in. So here we see that there will be an increase in the close approaches with the space objects, these uncatalogued and cataloged fragments and space objects. And due to the short lifespan of these mega constellation satellites, there'll be a need to frequently replenish them after every 5 years or so. So that will also add on to the number of space objects in the low Earth orbits, unless they are properly disposed of by bringing them down to the Earth orbit or to put them up. So that probability will go on increasing unless we manage the debris or we mitigate or we put in active traffic management guidelines. Till now, there are no active traffic management guidelines in the low Earth orbit, and such guidelines are present in the high seas in the international airspace, but not in the outer space. That is the need of the time now. And along with that, there has to be active sharing of high position data so that all the operators and the stakeholders are able to get the positional activities of the other space objects and then can actively maneuver. There should also be norms of first action as to who should act first in case of a collision probability. So those sort of things, the rules of the road should be laid down for the outer space activities. The industry has also put in a number of initiatives in order to avoid any mishaps in the low Earth orbit and to put in proper mechanisms to for a sustainable space usage of the low Earth orbit. And here are some of these initiatives. And recently, the United Nations has also come up with resolution that it has adopted. It has adopted to reduce the satellite space through norms, rules, and principles of responsible behaviors. Though it is not non-binding, but it is a great step, and it will lay down some rules, binding rules in the future. So I'll just end my presentation with this quote from Mark Twain. He says that history never repeats itself, but it does often rhyme. So basically, we may not witness similar events in the outer space operations if we learn lessons from the aerospace events, like the air traffic. All the air traffic initiatives were started after the 1956 air crash of the Grand Canyon, wherein 128 people were killed due to collision of two spacecraft. So if we act early, probably we can stop such events in the outer space, and it can create a sustainable and safer outer space for all of us. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Mr. Roy. Last but not the least, I call Mr. Ashok GV from Factum Law with his presentation.
I've been reliably told that brevity is my friend, so my presentation is going to be as short and as sweet as possible. Let me quickly cut to the chase. So I think we have heard some very illustrious panelists speak about the business approach, the security aspects of space, and of course the issue of mega constellations. And what we are now asking ourselves is, do the latest drafts of the space policies really capture the full spectrum of topics that are now coming into the picture? And that is what I wish to focus on in my presentation. Okay, so let's first ask ourselves, there is a clear distinction between the intent behind the policy and what the language of the policy conveys. And I think this is the area where we have had consistent concerns with laws of the country, because what is intended by the lawmakers may not necessarily be reflected in the language of the policy itself. And when it comes to finally enforcing or implementing the policies, those gaps start to really surface, and then we are frantically reacting and trying to address those gaps on an ad hoc basis. I think what we have to ask ourselves is, can we proactively develop the vision to develop a policy that can actually carry us forward for the next 5 to 10 years maintaining a balance between rigidity on one side and flexibility for evolution on the other. So I think the first thing that we have to ask ourselves is, what are the objectives of the space policy that we should target, right? And to my mind, I think if we are looking at the private sector as the target beneficiaries, then I think the objectives of the space policy must be focused on three things. One is what are the kind of foreign direct investment targets we want to meet for the space sector in this country? Two, what is the size of the domestic industry that we wish to grow in the space sector? And three, while the effort towards indigenization and localization is obviously very well appreciated, there is also a problem with compliances under the World Trade Organization regimes, the general agreements for trades and tariffs, and how do we then balance the competing interests of globalization and indigenization? And to that end, I think what we need to do is to not just focus on indigenization as our approach, but also look at flexibilities for awarding contracts to foreign companies directly, but add a caveat saying that any foreign country who is, or a foreign national who is getting a contract from the Indian government to do business in space also has certain offset obligations which they can discharge by working with local businesses. And I think this is a way where we can ensure that what happened with the solar industry in the WTO does not repeat itself in the space sector. Now, this next question to my mind, which is an area of significant interest, is the roles of the regulators, because we have heard about this new actor in the space regulation business, which is IN-SPACe. But we have also seen that there is no explicit disclaimer that either the DOS or the DOT or the NRSE have been altogether done away with in terms of their role in regulating space activities. And to my mind, I think the agencies with most amount of regulatory experience in each domain have to necessarily assume lead in terms of regulating the specific activity. So upstream launch activities, whether by the private sector or otherwise, best served by the Department of Space. Communication, DOT has done it really well all these years, and there's no reason why the DOT should not take over space communications. And NRSE, having had a background in remote sensing, I think is uniquely positioned to ensure that there is adequate regulation for remote sensing activities. But what we need to understand, and I think especially with the other panelists coming forward and discussing their points, is that space cannot be regulated only by the space regulators alone. I think there are collateral regulators that will invariably be involved. So we need home and defense to come in to ensure that a proposed commercial space activity is clear in terms of security, in terms of defense implications. We need law and justice ministry to come forward and ensure that any decision taken on an application by the private sector is adjudicated correctly in accordance with law and not treated in an arbitrary manner so as to either attract an action under the Constitution or under bilateral investment treaties. And lastly, we also need agencies like Trade and Commerce and Ministry of External Affairs to get involved to ensure that we are in compliance with international obligations in the manner in which we treat applicants, and Trade and Commerce to ensure that the business perspective is not lost. So decisions actually augment or enhance business objectives and do not impede predictability and clarity in terms of India as a regulatory destination for investments in space. Okay, so what do we propose? What we propose is that the policy is tweaked further. We enhance the scope of the policy. First and foremost, I think the policy should actually stipulate the creation of a toolkit for prospective applicants who want to do commercial space activities. This toolkit should specify what are the various steps involved, who will be the first regulator to whom the application is filed, who will be the second regulator. It should provide a term sheet of the potential license terms and conditions so that the actor knows what to expect. There must be promise of confidentiality so that sensitive technologies can be confidently disclosed without there being any fear that tomorrow it's given to a third party under the Right to Information Act. And to give you a simple example, today we know that there are security requirements for adjudicating an application for SATCOM activities, but we still don't know what are the kind of security requirements that we will have to comply with. Now, if those kind of requirements are actually published and ensured that it is available for prospective applicants, I think it goes a great step in ensuring that we have clarity when we apply for licenses, and the regulators also know that there is a framework that they can fall back on. Now, the next thing is, of course, we did talk about startups and how a lot of space-related government contracts can actually just go to the bigger players. But in order to encourage the smaller players, what can be done is that the government can come up with a list of accredited startups who can be nominated as nominated subcontractors, so that when the big agencies get their contracts, the condition from the government can be that some part of the project has to be assigned to a nominated subcontractor. So this is one way in which smaller agencies or smaller actors who can't otherwise access big government contracts are still able to benefit from government contracts in space activities. Thirdly, I think the intent and vision on mitigating space debris and enhancing space situational awareness is fantastic. But unless and until the policy actually announces subsidies and funding initiatives for these technologies, the principle on paper will never truly translate into practice. So I think the policy must announce in no uncertain terms that there is subsidies available and there will be subsidies available for companies that actually do work in space debris mitigation. Lastly, high value contracts involving granting of licenses, especially with in respect of the 2G spectrum scandal that we saw, or any of the other cases where the Supreme Court has been quite active. It is important that the government takes a suo motu initiative that if it is a high value license, they will themselves approach the Supreme Court for a clarification as to whether the manner of licensing is in compliance with the Constitution or not, so that tomorrow the agencies or the private actors know that license granted will not arbitrarily be cancelled. And lastly, I think the government should look at regular workshops and seminars to actually announce what is their intent, how they intend to implement the policies, and how they intend to execute some of these policies. So concluding remarks, I think is as follows. So policy is the foundation. I think we need to understand that we still don't know what are the functions of InSpace, what are the roles and responsibilities of InSpace, what are the powers of InSpace. Same thing with the other regulators. And I think that is something that the potential law will have to stipulate. But policy should essentially outline the broad contours of governmental approach and attitude in the space sector. So for example, what is going to be the attitude and approach to foreign entities looking to do private space businesses? What is the attitude and approach for Indian businesses looking to do business in space? We need to also ensure that private sector enterprises that are catering to defense needs in the space sector are also provided some level of sovereign guarantees and sovereign indemnities, for the simple reason that if I'm servicing a defense customer as a private enterprise, I am fair game in a military conflict. I can be targeted under the rules of international humanitarian law. So if I'm going to take that risk and that investment of catering to a defense requirement, what is the protection that I'm going to get in return? This is something that policy will have to stipulate, especially with the proliferation of ASAT tests and non-kinetic weapons against satellite technologies. We need to ensure that we avoid siloed evolution of laws. For example, we are talking about non-personal data being regulated under privacy regulations, but at the same time, we are also seeing proliferation of remote sensing activities. Now, if tomorrow the image of a land is considered non-personal data, and suddenly we have a whole new set of compliances for remote sensing businesses, the entire business model can collapse overnight. So I think it's important that government agencies talk to one another. We ensure that regulations don't develop in isolation, and that there is a harmonized approach towards regulating space activities. The non-personal data and remote sensing imagery being one example. And the other point is that we have very steep intercept and monitoring requirements under SATCOM licensing requirements. But as privacy laws continue to become more and more compliant with global standards, can these intercept and monitoring requirements continue in the present shape? Number one. And number two, can we afford to relax them given the geopolitical context we are in? So I think these are some things that we will have to deliberate upon as laws evolve on this matter. And last but not the least, I think we need to really look at translating international obligations into diplomatic opportunities. Our Tampere Convention is a fantastic example of cross-border movement of telecommunication equipment during crisis and disaster management. And it is a fantastic opportunity for India to use it as one of the mechanisms to build relationships, forge alliances. And for that, we need to have domestic policies that actually reflect the Tampere Convention and ensure that's greater compliance of Outer Space Treaty and other international space obligations. And I think if we are able to kind of really take this approach of ensuring laws don't develop in silos, they evolve in a harmonized manner, address military, business, law, and defense, I think we are going to actually see a space policy that will carry us through the ages and not see the repeat of the earlier SATCOM policy, which really did not lead to the kind of commercial space activity we are hoping for. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ashok. The floor is now open for questions. If you have questions, participants, please drop it in the chat box and I'll take it from there for addressing every panelist. I'll just start with the question answers here. The first question goes to Mr. Anil. Sir, we would like to know with regards to satellites in the constellations, like they have a short lifespan and they are placed very rapidly with the identical satellites. And this poses a great challenge, not only for the satellite identification, but also licensing. So how would you comment upon balancing that could be achieved with this technological evolution and with adequate permissive regulatory regime at this point in time?
I think in this direction, thank you for your question. I think ITO has taken a significant role in rationalizing the satellite, like by registering them and then coordinating and also taking away from the shelving, because there were a lot of bogus registration was taking earlier, paper registration. So they have also put a price to it, and so non-serious players should not be entertained. So there's some mechanism has been taken. The same time, the number of countries, they have a lot of vacant satellite orbital slots are lying vacant, and then you see that the countries like Rwanda or Uganda have been filing numbers of satellites. So I think the non-state actors are coming and they're using those countries' footprint where they don't have a satellite. So I think this is more of a country-to-country coordination, and also the same time that sizable footprint is available to each country, so they will launch satellites for their own good use. India, so to start with that, I think India should take a lead into that, allowing the private satellite to launch their satellite thing, and also help in coordinating and filing footprint orbital slot in the ITU. So I think this is the problem which is not only going to impact a country, but is going to impact all of countries, because if there are satellites being up in the sky, and so this is the collective responsibility of the nations to work together. Same time, the private industry has to also have to work in tandem with the government. So this is a serious play, this is a serious problem which we are going to face, and we are facing right now. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. My next question goes to Mr. Ashok. Like you said in your presentation, there are lots of regulatory gaps and policy inclusions that need to be made while we address the coming era of space in India. Specifically with regards to the private sector, since you've been practicing and advocating the privates, my question to you is, how would India work upon the space insurance as an inclusion in their policy? Because as of now, if we see, there is very less way of incentivizing the FDI or incentivizing the private sector that's trying to come up in India. But space insurance is one part where the bill kind of lacks. So how would you comment on that?
Absolutely. I think one of the advantages that India has in terms of the insurance is that we have a very vibrant and a very well-established history of state-owned insurance companies. And I think India can take the lead and ensure that some of the state-owned agencies like, say, LIC or New India Assurance, I think these are the agencies that can actually evolve the kind of insurance packages that startups can have access to. Because the global market in terms of insurance for Indian startups may not be really accessible or feasible for all kinds of startups. So I think India has to take a state-led initiative in the insurance sector, come out with policies and come out with packages that are easily accessible to space startups. Because if we are truly serious about indigenization, we cannot have indigenization if we don't create the collateral support that space activities need, insurance being one of them. So my immediate solution would be that a state-led insurance initiative is the need of the hour, and that can actually be the starting point.
All right, thank you. My next question to Dr. Pillai. In your presentation, like you spoke about having a doctrine or a military doctrine for space. and there needs to be a collaboration for the private sector. But should the private sector or the private owners of these satellites in space be concerned with regards to servicing military customers, given the kind of proliferation we have with regards to ASAT or non-kinetic weapons for that matter of fact? So what basically should be the plan?
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think there are several complexities involved. One is that space is such a dual asset, so it can be sort of, for instance, if a private sector corporation is going to be launching a payload which is mixed in nature, which can be used for both civilian functions, but also certain military oriented functions. So suppose one of your adversaries is going to be sort of wanting to target something. So how does the private sector, what kind of recourse of what kind of actions that can he take in a sense? Should the particular payload be sort of targeted? What are the kind of, does the state have, does the state that has been affected in a sense, where the private sector is located in, do they have any sort of a mechanism to deal with it? What are the kind of steps that come into play? I think there are serious questions. Second is, of course, so one is the mixed payload, and that happens, dual use aspects. Second is the mixed payload. A launch could be carrying both civilian and military payloads. Again, when that happens, and if the private sector is engaged in that particular activity, how does that come into play? What are the kind of issues out there? And I think these are mainly we look at this as a Western phenomena, because mostly the private sector is still dominated by the Western countries in a sense. It's changing, including in Asia. In Japan has been somewhat more pro in this regard, but China, it's changing. China and India are also changing. But again, we don't have a clarity on many of these aspects as to how some of the private sector participation, how do you facilitate that? How do you deal with them when there are missions are targeted, and so on and so forth? But I think the other aspect is also about the kind of what kind of space you talked about the military doctrine, but also, more broadly, can we agree upon a broad set of rules of the road, both at the global level, but also at the domestic level? At the global level, this can emerge, and this should translate into something more domestic regulations in a sense. But where are we in terms of developing those rules of the road? We are at a kind of a complete standstill. There has been no progress for the last several decades now, in a sense. I think we were hopeful at many a time over the last decade and a half. 2011, for instance, the EU came up with a code of conduct for outer space, international code of conduct for outer space activities. We thought it was going to make some progress despite the initial sort of reservation from a number of countries, because the EU formulated something that they thought that was going to be good for the rest of the world. So there were problems with the process issue. Then we have had two GGs, group of governmental experts, one on TCBMs, that is transparency and confidence building measures. There was a second GG on PAROS, the prevention of arms race in outer space, in 2018-2019. And the second GG was even more of a disaster, because the group could not even agree upon a consensus report. I was part of that process. I was a technical advisor to the group, so I knew the kind of contentious adversarial nature of debates and the manner in which it fell apart, in a sense. So there are serious issues when it comes to, and then of course you have the PPWT, the Russia-China proposed draft treaty on the prevention of the placement of weapons in outer space, PPWT. Again, it hasn't seen much progress, including from countries like India, that has generally supported legally binding mechanisms, but mainly because, one, it gives a extremely it comes up with new definitions on what space weapon is, what space object is, in a sense, and so on and so forth. Second, there is an excessive focus on placement of weapons in outer space without giving due regard to the ground-based assets like the kinetic ASAT missiles that can be used to target assets in outer space. So you don't have to necessarily put something in space to target somebody else's asset, but you can use a ground-based asset to target, or cyber, or any other means to target somebody else's assets, in a sense. So because those issues are not really, have not found much of any mention really in the PPWT. So even countries like India, that has generally supported legally binding verifiable mechanisms, have not supported PPWT. So we are at a standstill. So I keep wondering, are we waiting for some major catastrophic event to happen and then realize the need for us to have some sort of an agreement, some sort of maybe it can start as a political agreement, because today, given the great power politics and the balance of power dynamics and so on and so forth, trust and confidence in each other is at zero level. So if we have to start the process of trusting each other, developing basic levels of understanding and confidence in each other, maybe we need to start with some information sharing agreements that are political in nature, so that you get into the habit of understanding each other better. That gives scope for at a later, slightly on a gradual fashion, you can go on to develop more binding measures, including legal treaties and so on and so forth.
Thank you, Dr. Pillai. Very well said. Yes, absolutely. There has to be a trust, and it's a true two-way road. And for doing that, there needs to be steps that need to be taken. Yes. My next question goes to Mr. Chinmoy. We would like to know, with regards to CubeSats and with regards to miniaturization of the technology that has been the current trend in the industry, there has been, gaps in the legislation around it. So first and prior question is, should it be a matter of policy or a matter of law? And if a blend of both, how would you want to take this norm further?
Thank you for the question. It's a really interesting one. So CubeSats, what I see is there is a number of problems associated with CubeSats. Like in CubeSats, we do not have any specific size for which is allowed. So that gives rise to the first problem of tracking. There are a number of CubeSats which are not easily trackable when they are in the orbit. So there has to be a particular standard size, that below this there should not be a satellite of a smaller size should not be allowed to be in orbit, or if it is of a smaller size, it should only be allowed to be in, say, the orbit of around 400 kilometers, so that there's an automatic drag and it can be pulled by the Earth's gravity, and it will be disposed of on its own. That's the first problem. The second problem is that the CubeSats, majority of them do not have any thrusters or maneuvering ability. So in case of a collision avoidance, if at all such a situation arises, the CubeSats are virtually paralyzed. They cannot move from their place, from the designated orbit, and it has to be the other satellite to act in order to prevent that collision. However, the damage caused as per the Kessler syndrome, it will impact the entire orbital spectrum in that particular orbit. So that is the second problem. The third problem is that the technology that is being used, there are a number of commercially off-the-shelf CubeSats that are being manufactured by a number of industries around the world. This is called the quartz technology. So there is no standardization on that. And as Rajeshwari ma'am very rightly pointed out, the cybersecurity issues are a big issue, and we do not always need a kinetic attack to paralyze a space system. We can do it from our ground-based systems as well. So there, if the cybersecurity measures are not adequately present in the CubeSats, then it is a loophole that can be very easily exploited from the ground systems. So there has to be a standard that needs to be laid down from the cybersecurity infrastructure in the CubeSats as well. So these are the three main problems that we see in the CubeSats. And along with that, like FCC has put out in the US regulator for satellites has put out an plan related to satellite disposal also needs to be brought out when they are applying for a license. Similar licensing regimes should be present in almost all major jurisdictions, and it has to be uniform. Like if I am launching from US, probably I'll need to have a small ion thruster in my CubeSat. But if I launch from, say, any other country which does not have a very developed space policy system, then probably I can get off without any thruster and I can operate, and that will be in fact cheaper for my operations.
True.
So that is something which needs to be addressed. So there, Purvi, coming to a specific answer, I would say that an international law is the need of the hour for regulating CubeSats. Any policy or a domestic law in silos or a standalone approach is not going to help the entire ecosystem.
Long run, in the long perspective. Yes, thank you. Thank you. I have a question from the
Practically, who
audience.
wants to add something?
Yes, yes.
No, I just want to quickly come in on that point, and I think Ashok also raised it towards in the concluding slide, the non-siloed approach, break the silos and bring in a holistic perspective involving all the different stakeholders. That is so need of the hour, because you cannot deal with, for instance, when Mr. Roy talked about the cyber problem, cyber hacking to some of your satellites and so on and so forth. You cannot just have a cybersecurity folks sit in one room and talk about these issues, and space folks sit in but at the same, so I am all for breaking the silos and bringing an integrated approach. But I think that we also have another challenge, and especially given the current times, the challenge of writing a holistic agreement, bringing together all the different components. That's going to be a Herculean task as well. So
Yes.
I also sort of have a suggestion to look at, maybe we need to have smaller technical agreements that would deal with each of these issues in a compartmentalized fashion, at least as a starting point, because I'm all for building a holistic sort of an overall approach to the sort of an agreement. But at the same time, given the kind of, and imagine the kind of difficulty in building consensus agreement among all the different players involving all the different issues. So you're bringing in cyber folks, you're bringing in somebody else, hypersonic, you are bringing in AI, you're bringing in building that kind of a consensus is going to be a Herculean task, and therefore it's also sort of easier and somewhat more sort of approachable to have those small technical agreements as a starting point, and then go on to build a much larger treaty mechanism in a sense.
Well said. Yes, absolutely. Because it's what is happening right now is it's all over the place. So it needs to be consolidated and put under one roof. I have one question for Mr. Anil. This is from
Purvi, sorry, I think Ashok raised his hand, so maybe he wants to comment quickly.
I'll just quickly just take 1 minute. I think the private sector need not necessarily wait for governments to actually come out with these technical agreements. A fantastic parallel is standard setting organizations in the world of telecommunication devices. I think the satellite industry can come out with its own standard setting organizations, come out with technical standards for, say, CubeSats, and cover all issues of debris mitigation, maneuvering, cybersecurity, have those standards weighed in, and government regulations can then refer to the standards and say that we will not give you permission unless you meet the standards set by the standard setting organizations. So I think the private sector also should take thought leadership initiatives and not keep waiting for governments to come back. This is one way in which we can actually set the ball rolling. And that's the point I just want to make.
True. I have one question for Mr. Anil from Mr. Gopal Krishnan Vardalaju. He says, is SIA planning to provide support to space service providers who offer such services through their value space assets and ground stations beyond national territories?
Yes, answer is yes, because we trying to, as my presenters say, we have to work in collaboration. And what are the industry needs of collaboration, whether it is legal fertility, whether it is the funding institutions or the academia, they all have to work in collaboration. And India is a very small country in terms of the space activism is concerned. So we have to, by and large, we have to depend majorly in the countries which are much larger in their operations. So we have to draw a lot of learning first from them. In fact, we have to collaborate, reach out to them, and make them much more meeting grounds. So right now, because we hardly any opportunity for the international space players to come in India, but I think we should go out and meet them. So we are making those collaboration with number of countries or association abroad, so we can reach out to them more quickly, and the benefit goes to the space industry, Indian space industry. So the answer is very much yes. You can contact me offline.
Absolutely.
Put everything.
Drop in your details, sir. Thank you. I conclude the session. Very quick closing remarks. As the deliberations of this entire session have gone smooth, and what we have learned here is that we are all set and geared for the private sector. We have opened up the doors. India is right there, and the world is looking at India right now, where doors for the private sector are opened. However, all those small little nitty-gritties of the tweaks that are supposed to be made in the policy inclusion or the legality around commercialization and privatization of space, India needs to gear up that before you make it public, before you bring it out as one holistic law, it needs to first map it with the international standards set up by the UN Corpus. It also needs to bring in a holistic approach wherein all the panelists today have brought forth one point which is redundant and common amongst them all, that India needs to first build its national domestic law with regards to what is happening internationally, and it also needs to address all the elephants in the room, not in silos, but or compartmentalize it, but bring it together under one roof. And the best way to start it is by making small little technical bringing in small little drafts around each one of them, addressing every elephant in the room, and thereafter making out the first Space Act for itself, which is robust, which has the entire policy perfectly set in place for the private sector, where there is no ambiguity of law, and which opens doors, especially for the private sector, given that space is a $360 billion industry. This is one way of strengthening our economy, and this is one way where we can also combat issues with regards to space debris, with regards to sustainability, long-term sustainability, in fact, and also with regards to the security threats or the cyber threats that we have, given that space is not just a commercial hub, but also the final frontier. So having said that, I thank all my panelists today for their valuable time, for the insights and the inputs that we have brought here together holistically, bringing and one last thing that I would like to ask before I conclude the session to all the panelists: the conference theme, the rise and fall of the transport industry. How would you quickly comment upon this particular question? Where do you see the space industry going with regards to being hit by COVID recently and the economy suffering due to lack of paucity of funds here? How do you see it? Quick question.
Should I go?
Anyone?
I can probably start if everyone else is okay with it. I think COVID was actually a great opportunity for the space industry to make itself more relevant. To give you a simple example, remote sensing satellite was a fantastic manner in which you can actually monitor assets remotely without actually physically traveling there. So for example, if you have oil and natural gas assets that you want to monitor remotely, or agricultural land that you want to monitor remotely because travel is restricted, I think those are areas in which satellite technology was really a great enabler. So, and since we are now increasingly more dependent on communication, like for example, this very conference, I do see things like COVID as an opportunity for space sector to find itself a more robust market. Of course, there will be other challenges, but in terms of the question rise or fall, I think the space industry is only going to rise. The mining interest in the long term, especially, is going to be the new gold rush of our times. And I think we really need to ensure that we have regulations to make sure we don't become the new Wild West in space. So that's how I would look at it.
Thank you, Ashok. Dr. Pillai.
Yeah, very quickly I think a couple of things. One, I think the private sector entry of the commercial actors, for instance, has democratized space in a sense. Access to space has become that much cheaper. You have the reusable launches and kind of things. And so that market is going to flourish. And given that the use of space has been acknowledged and appreciated by a large number of players, only very in recent years. So the access to space becoming cheaper is a sort of a big incentive, it's a big boost for the developing countries from across, whether it is developing countries in Africa, Asia, or Latin America, and so on and so forth. So it's a good time for these countries to start exploring what they can use and how they can use space to change the social and economic lives of the people. So that's number one. So access to space having become cheaper because of the sort of entry of private sector players who have democratized the space sector. The second is, of course, the COVID-related restrictions. It has brought in a lot of innovation and kind of thing, but also there are limits to funds available for startups and small and medium-sized enterprises. So I would see collaboration among a cluster of small and these enterprises to be possibly the going forward in a sense. So there could be possible collaborative ventures between Indian and Australian firms maybe, or in Indian and Japanese firms maybe, or Indian and the US American firms. So I think the possibilities of collaboration I would think has increased is manyfold because of the sort of maybe shortage of lack of funds available with that much ease in as it was during the pre-COVID days. So I think those are going to formulate new partnerships and new enterprises in that sense coming forward. And I think that's a good thing, because I think a collaborative approach in that sense to develop some of the niche technologies and kind of things in this area, for whether it is for remote sensing and whole range of operations, broadband industry, communications and all of that stuff, whether it's civil sector or in the defense communication sectors, all of these are going to be important. So if the cooperative ventures can be found because of the sort of a funds deficit, but it can be looked at in a way how that's kind of giving way to more collaborative ventures between partners from India and around the world in a sense.
Very right, very right. Mr. Anil, your comments.
Well, I said rise in terms of I think that COVID has put satellite on the forefront, and the uses which or the reach which satellite can provide is not more underlining, and I think this is definitely rise for the satellite connectivity ways, because India has a large population which is still not connected. Almost close to about 50% of rural population is not connected yet. Fall in terms of the funding, because these are the high tech and the large funding projects. I think the COVID has restricted the funding mechanism. I think that is this need is that more funding is required, and funding has been shrinked in terms of the COVID is concerned. But definitely the supply chain is a major issue which need to be looked into it. Of course, satellites can definitely much better role in terms of the connectivity, in terms of reaching out to people and providing not only G2C but also to B2B or B2C area. I think this is we have seen that what was being taken as a satellite few years back before COVID. Now people talk about the satellites connectivity. And in my slide set, the satellite has services that touch greatly in India in terms of the financial sector, in terms of the digital cinema, in terms of the connectivity to rural segments. I think satellite is definitely poised to play a great role in that terms. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Roy.
Yes, so I would like to emphasize on three aspects. First is that the technological innovation is a non-stop process, and we are really witnessing interesting times wherein we have seen a great leap in terms of technology and access of outer space. So having said that, in order to sustain this development phase, the governments around the world need to come up with various financial incentives and a clear regulatory regime so as to foster this growth. Along with that, there has to be a clarity on the liability aspect and the insurance aspect, because now it is sort of completely unclear as to what would be the liability that a startup would be facing if it launches a satellite or if it ventures into the outer space. So there has to be some cap, and that can only happen if there is a consistent regulatory regime, and that the operators are also incentivized that, okay, if something goes south, then we are there to help you out. And this would be the maximum liability that you would be facing. Along with that, as Ashok sir very rightly pointed out, the insurance sector, there is a great potential in India, and some of the national insurance companies have also come up, but there is still needed some more clarity as to what would be the extent of insurance and how will that pan out. So if we take care of these two aspects, that there is some sort of clarity regarding the liability of startups getting into the sector, and there are some financial incentives. And I must point out two examples here, the Netherlands and the UK. During the COVID times, they have supported their MSMEs in a really great way. We interact with some companies in the Netherlands and also in the UK. They have got really good incentives to run their businesses in the COVID times, the space sector. So that sort of incentives should be there to all the startups, because this is a very high risk industry, and unless that is there, there's an entry barrier that needs to be crossed, and that can only help with government help. So that, having said that, there's a great potential, and obviously we'll witness a lot in the coming times as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Roy. I think COVID has been an eye-opener, not just for here and there, but for space industry. I think it's seen a boom, unlike its counterpart, the aviation. A lot has fallen on what we need to do and what gets going. So I thank you all for your time today, and really on behalf of Aerospace and Aviation Association of India, Nalsar, University of Law, and Lexa Wright, I thank you all for your time and joining us here for the deliberations today. Our next round of technical discussions will be technical round 2, which will start at 11:45. It is transport and environment, the special case of aviation. Thank you, everyone. We look forward to your collaborations, and we look forward to having you over for further as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Purvi, and thank you once again to all the panelists. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take care. Have a nice day.